Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone joining us. If you're joining us across the Asia Pacific, good morning to you. If you're out of the US, depending where you are, good evening. And of course, over in Europe, why are you still up? It's quite late. My name is David Ingles. I'm from Bloomberg. Welcome to World City Festival. I think I'd like to start off by, and as you can probably see, acknowledging the help of the peninsula today and giving us this beautiful space, the presidential suite, for today's discussion. It takes us then into the topic of discussion, and as I guess everyone is aware, 2020's been difficult because of the pandemic. In the case of Hong Kong, where we are right now, coping with COVID has, in a lot of ways, brought a lot of hard realities. It's brought a lot of lessons that we learned in the past, and hopefully because of this, we are set to learn new ones. And I think in Hong Kong's case, along with many cities in the world, like New York, for example, very densely populated, the economy here did not, compared to other places in the world, did not go through the same as stringent mobility restrictions, but nonetheless, of course, we are in a recession in Hong Kong, as many places in the world. So part of this discussion, as we move along and as we put this behind us, hopefully quite soon, is how do we then balance public health and also the health of the economy? At some point, we'll need to find a balance for that. So to help us answer that question, I'd like to introduce our panel for today, starting with, on the far right, maybe from your screens, Mr. Jacob Kam. He's the CEO of MTR Corporation that runs the transit system here in the city. Next to him is Professor Ben Cowling. He's a professor and division head of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. In other words, he is our leading expert on the COVID-19 outbreak and infectious diseases here. Mr. Clement Kwok is the Chief Executive Officer of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Hotels Group. Thank you for having us here. And Jason McLean, journalist, columnist, and regular contributor, Nat Geo, New York Times, and of course runs a small business here, Entrepreneur as well, which we will get to as we talk about the sort of economic impact of all of this. I guess to start things off, very simple question. This thing caught everyone off guard. There was no perfect response to this. Jacob, let me start with you. What was the biggest eye-opener from this?
What actually amazed me was the speed with which the Hong Kong people have adapted to the situation. Now, of course, for MTR, we have a playbook, we have a contingency plan. So when the alert level goes up, we have upgraded our ventilation regime, cleaning regime. We order the robots and so on, the mask and the sanitizers made available for our customers. But of course, our customers actually respond quickly and responsibly to some of the call for taking precautions during the epidemic. So I think this is the Hong Kong that I used to know. They are flexible, responsive to situation, and take actions.
Ben?
For me, I've been working on epidemics and pandemics for more than 10 years in Hong Kong, studying them and thinking about what might happen. When we were planning what we might do in pandemics, whether it's influenza or other diseases, we have a hurricane scale, category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in 2009, we had a flu pandemic that was kind of a category 1 level pandemic. What shocked me was the severity of COVID, that it's almost off the charts. It's not even a category 5 pandemic in our previous playbook. It's beyond that. It's really spreads really easily, and it's really severe. And that's why we've seen so many countries struggling to deal with it, because even the plans that have been made for regular influenza pandemics or epidemics, you need more than that to deal with COVID-19.
Clement?
To me, the biggest eye-opener was we have, in the world over the past 30 years, built up a major infrastructure which is dependent on international travel, be it for leisure, for business, and there are many elements of this infrastructure: airlines, hotels, car rental companies, the whole raft of them. And we never expected how quickly everything could come crumbling down all at the same time. And that was a big shock. We have hotels in Asia, in North America, and in Europe, but we never expected that they would all suffer so much at the same time. And so the reaction to that has had to be very extreme. Now, the other eye-opener, and this is pretty much also what Jacob was saying, was then the reaction of our staff and our people around the world. And this is not only in Hong Kong, but around the world as well. You know, I've been so touched by the resilience of people, their loyalty, the spirit that they have maintained, and everything they have done in reaction to this crisis. And that has included, I mean, obviously, we've introduced hygiene protocols, we have put in place disinfectation. Actually, we've even put in more healthy meals into our staff canteens to support them. But people have had to do tasks that they're not used to. They've had to accept, maybe some furloughing arrangements and all of this. But despite that, the level of support and understanding of people actually speaks to a great amount of goodness in this world.
And something tells me we'll come out of this stronger because of that spirit. Dae-san, let me bring it to you. What are your thoughts on that?
I have a few. I'd like to step back because it's a global audience. I'd like to step back and take a big picture look at it. The most eye-opening thing to me about the coronavirus was how, well, the speed of it, as you said, Jacob, but for me, it was watching how in the space of a few short months, all the coronavirus exposed the cracks and failures of societies and governments around the world, not just in Hong Kong. For instance, in the US, it was almost like a heat-seeking missile that completely laid bare what was lacking in particular societies. In the US, lack of public health care and starving the social and public spending for 35 years. In China, you are seeing the huge flaws of an authoritarian system, a strongman system. Wuhan happened because people were afraid to speak up. And so we lost critical weeks that we should have been able to get started faster on this or even stop it before it got out of Wuhan. In Hong Kong, we've had tremendous amounts of sacrifice on the part of Hong Kong people. However, we have to also acknowledge that the trust in our government and the steps that our government has taken have been not always optimal. And there is a lack of trust. I mean, the figures are something like 28% or 29% of Hong Kong people right now trust the Hong Kong government. Trust is essential to fighting the coronavirus. If we do not trust what our governments are asking us to sacrifice for public good, then people aren't going to do it. They're going to get cynical. And I see this happening, unfortunately. I hate to be downbeat, but someone has to be. I see cynicism beginning to creep in to this particular society. So basically, this is a disease not just of the physical body, but it's also a disease that's laying bare the deficiencies of the global political, social, public body.
And as I guess we alluded to at the very beginning of this conversation, there was no perfect response. Wealthy country, not wealthy country. Ben, on that point, I'd like to ask you, Hong Kong arguably was the most prepared because of SARS. And what the SARS experience taught us was, well, the government had a framework through which to respond to this quickly. And I would imagine more importantly, the public was more receptive of the government telling them what not to do. In fact, the public here in Hong Kong, back in January when it was starting out, stayed at home. Your thoughts on what new thing we learned from this to build on what we learned in SARS?
So I think going back to SARS, Hong Kong people learned a lot about what an epidemic can do to a community, the impact it can have. In SARS, we only had 1,700 something cases, 300 deaths. Already we've seen COVID go far, far, far beyond that. But I think the memory of SARS meant that in Hong Kong, we built up capacity, we built up preparedness, we were ready for something like COVID, and the response was immediate back in January. Even before the government started taking actions, people had changed their behaviors as a response to that. Going forward, I think a lot of parts of the world, other places, are going to look to Hong Kong for those lessons we learned from SARS, how we did prepare better for COVID-19, how we've been able to handle COVID so much better than many other parts of the world. And so then the next time, they will be better prepared, just like we have been for COVID.
Jacob, anything in particular that you think the Hong Kong government did exceptionally well that many other governments should pay attention to? And equally, of course, where is there room for improvement?
Well, I think the overall resilience to pandemic situation like this require the whole of the community to work together. So it's not just only a government placing the requirements, the direction, supported by policies, but at the same time, people, as Daizan pointed out, people have to trust the government and make the necessary sacrifice to actually to keep the disease under control. What we, as a company, for example, have been doing is that we keep our trains running. Our purpose is to keep Hong Kong running, not only in our transport system, but also our shopping malls, our housing estates. We try to, of course, incorporate the government's requirements, but at the same time, we try to communicate with our customers so that they can comply with the requirements. I think we need the whole community working together, not just, of course, government taking the lead, but the whole community working together.
I'm curious, since you brought it up, and right recently, I see a lot more people in the streets. You have the data on mobility. To what extent have people actually started coming back and using public transport?
It's interesting. Now I can actually confirm that 20 to 30% of our business actually come directly or indirectly from visitors.
Right.
So when the borders and the boundaries are not yet reopened, we have at least 20-30% of our business not coming back. Now for the rest, gradually we are seeing some recovery. It's taking its time. In fact, we operate 10 times in terms of route kilometers of railway outside of Hong Kong. So in our operations in mainland China, we actually see most of the operations are coming back to normal in terms of patronage and business and so on. But a business in Australia, in UK, in Sweden, they are still far from signs of recovery.
Clement, let me bring you in, I guess, on that point before we get to the sort of permanent element that sort of filters into your industry. You guys are present pretty much in not all big cities, of course. You guys are very selective in where you go. But that said, it's varied as far as the regulatory framework is concerned in those places. Talk to us about that experience for you. How was it running a hotel in one place where the rules and regulations were completely different from another place?
Maybe before I get onto that, I can add on to what
Sure,
Jacob said
of
about
course.
Hong Kong. I think in general, I feel the Hong Kong government has done quite a good job in terms of managing COVID. And of course, the numbers speak for themselves. We have very low numbers of infections as compared to many places in the world. I also think that is not just the government, but the discipline of Hong Kong people. They're very good at wearing masks, cleaning their hands. They're very conscious and aware of health risk, which is very good. And because of that, actually, if you look at Hong Kong at the moment, in terms of local activities, okay, maybe the health experts might say there's a bit too much going on, but life is pretty normal in Hong Kong. People go out, people pursue their leisure activities, your restaurants are full and so on, and we're not seeing many cases. However, from my point of view, of course, being in the travel industry, and of course, we care very much about human lives, we have to be very careful, but I do think that we have to strike a balance between health risk and employment and keeping the economy alive. And at the moment, I would say that industries like ours, and I mentioned earlier, the size of the global travel industry has been so badly affected by what's happening. So for me, yes, I think so far we've done a good job, but I think it's important now to establish travel protocols which can enable movements of people again. And for us in Hong Kong, actually, the most important market is mainland China.
Right.
And to the extent that we could have travel bubbles or travel protocols, and I think issues that have to be addressed include the ease of arrival in Hong Kong, testing by all means, but how it's tested, can it be quicker? Can we have some modifications in terms of quarantine requirements?
Right.
And what would enable some travel to start moving again? Of course, we welcome the news that there will be a travel bubble in Singapore or between Singapore and Hong Kong, but that's not enough. We need to work further on that.
It's a good start, and I'm glad you brought that up. So yesterday, just to bring this up on the show, we had a Hong Kong Tourism Board join us, and obviously their mandate is to promote Hong Kong as a destination for tourism. And this exact same topic came up. People are not going to wait 8-12 hours at the airport, even if the travel bubble is open. So things like testing needs to be improved. I want to bring you into this, Jason. You're an entrepreneur. in the tourism industry. Talk to us about that experience. And we were talking right before this started, it might no longer be viable for you.
Yeah, well, actually, I think that there's existing this idea in tourism globally that we're just going to have to wait it out and we're going to be able to go back to the way things were. Actually, I think that COVID is causing us to rethink and reset our idea about what travel is, what it should be. It's forcing ourselves to ask ourselves seriously, why are we traveling? Are we doing it for status, consumption, entertainment, or novelty? I think that in the future, our travels are going to have to be fewer and more purposeful. And the travel industry, unfortunately, as we've known it, this mass market TripAdvisor, 65 million visitors coming into Hong Kong every year, we can't go back to that. It's madness. It shouldn't come back like that because we're facing a future of, it's just not sustainable going into the future. And COVID has quickly made it very, very clear in a short amount. That's what I was telling you about, the way that COVID has just rushed into the cracks of our existing society and culture and laid bare what we can do going into the future and what we can't do. I think the idea that in Hong Kong we're going to go back to tens of millions of visitors a year coming into Hong Kong, that's just not going to work. Millions of people going around the world for business, for especially the mass market tourism. I think the mass market tourism is, and I know that this causes a lot of economic pain. I know that 10% of global GDP is tourism. 12% of Hong Kong's GDP is tourism. People are hurting, including myself. I have lost my business and my livelihood because of COVID, but I also recognize that we have to rethink what tourism is going to be in the world going forward.
I'd like to, Clement, does you want to say something?
I
Go ahead.
take issue with that.
Well, of course you have to.
Well, not only because it's my business, but we have seen the aspiration of people to travel. And you're not only talking of high income earners or high wealth people. Here in Hong Kong, I know people who are in quite sort of menial level jobs whose aspiration is to travel. And, even examples like, people I come across, who are engaged maybe, in our spa or the golf club and so on, people aspire to travel. So I think that aspiration continues. Now, if you apply that to our sector, which is the high end, we do fundamentally believe that there will continue to be a desire for enjoyment and luxury. By the way, I do agree that a lot of business travel, the substance of that may change a little bit because people have discovered video conferencing that works for them. Maybe there's not so much need to jump on a plane every time you have a meeting, and I think there'll be some changes in that. Actually, our belief is that in general, people will continue to aspire to travel, but particularly at the luxury end, because you're providing a very special experience, we think that that demand will come back. Now, of course, you have to offer the right product because people's tastes and requirements and desires will change over time, and it's important to provide a product that people want. But for instance, if we're talking about COVID, we will see that in mainland China, where we have actually very nice hotels in both Shanghai and Beijing, actually with the easing of restrictions, there has already been a tremendous return of business to the extent that Peninsula Shanghai has been enjoying 70 or 80% occupancy because domestically people are coming back to avail themselves of their service.
Well, that's the other point that I was hoping to bring up, but since we're talking about it already, I mean, what part of this, once this goes away, and I have a lot of contacts and friends in China, and the mindset is it's done, that's done, we're back to normal. To what extent is this back to normal, and to what extent are permanent changes about to take place in the industry?
For us, maybe we're a little bit unusual in the sense that our company has always been very long-term looking. You might be aware that whereas many companies offer management contracts, we don't. We are owner-operators of all of our assets, and we're always looking at a 100-year horizon. Now, if you're looking at a 100-year horizon, you have to be prepared for ups and downs and have the staying power to go through the ups and downs. And so therefore, we fundamentally do not believe that we're going to make many changes to our product. We think that that product is sustainable, the demand is going to continue. However, at the margin, as we've discussed, there will be some aspects of the travel industry that will have some changes. I mean, for a start, we might see a contraction in supply in some areas. There may be less airlines available, less hotels. You know, the financial viability of some of the businesses may be affected, and so there may have to be some adjustments. Now, what that is going to do to, for instance, the pricing of travel, will it become more expensive and less accessible, as maybe possibly suggested earlier, because of the changes in the economic balance?
Right.
And that is something that we'll have to see. But I do believe that the fundamentals of what people are looking for, which is attention, personalization, service, experience, I think the world has gotten used to desiring those things, and I believe that desire will continue.
Jacob, I don't want to bring you in, but in a couple of seconds, because in a few minutes, in fact, we are going to open the floor to your questions. So at this point, I'd like to invite everyone who's watching, please get your questions in. I'm sure you've thought of a few. Please get them in, and we'll try and get them, of course, to our panelists. Let me bring you in again. What changes permanently with your specific industry, public transport, and how does that influence things like investment decisions, where I should invest next, in what part of the business I should be investing?
In fact, we have noticed that there have been changes in traveling pattern. Okay, people they're now more flexible, working from home and going to work, at flexible hours and so on. I believe this will probably stay even after the pandemic. Now people have discovered that technology could actually help them to optimize their travel. In fact, for example, our apps could now provide real-time information about their traveling, about crowding. So people could actually plan their journey on a dynamic basis to, for example, to avoid crowding time during travel. So there will be some permanent change in the lifestyle of our citizens in their daily lives. We also notice that probably not because of pandemic, but even before the pandemics, there is a heightened awareness of the climate change, the climate situation. So we, in some of our operations that involve intercity trains, we notice that people are now cutting down flights. They would prefer to take, if they have to travel, they will take a more environmentally friendly mode of transport. That is also happening. I believe that will have an impact in the future when Hong Kong is reopened, when we are connected to other places. Environmentally friendly modes of travels will be more popular.
Right. Ben, the other interesting part to all of this, we look back at the experience and the economic health comes into play. Obviously, it's very hard to strike a balance between public health and the health of the economy. In fact, we did a story at Bloomberg, just to get that in here, that more people are going to die this year from hunger than COVID, and not to obviously cast any shadow on that. But that said, two-part question here. What would you suggest that balance be? And the other part to that question is, did we get lucky that COVID was not as deadly as other diseases like MERS or smallpox? And if that is the case, does that equation change?
Sure. So the first part is about the balance between protecting people's health and protecting the economy.
Right.
And I think right now, for the past 6 months, we've erred more on the side of protecting people's health, and there's been relatively more economic impact. And there's inequality everywhere in the world. In Hong Kong, we have inequality. And it's often the least well-off people, the lower income segment of the population that suffer the most from COVID. And when there's unemployment, it increases in that group first. And we're going to see long-term impact on people's health of the policies that have been put in place in the last 6 months. I think we do need to find a balance going forwards. We can't shut cities down for the long term. Hopefully we'll have a vaccine and then things can start to get back to normal. But we really do need this balance between protecting people's health and keeping the economy running, keeping society running, keeping people employed, and so on. For the second question, sorry, could you remind me?
If COVID had a mortality rate in the very low single digits, if it was any higher, say double digits, does that equation change? Or do people change that themselves, that they would just stay home?
I've been studying infectious diseases for many, many years, and pandemics for many, many years, and COVID is about the worst combination of a virus that's easy to transmit and still very severe. Actually, if it had been as severe as MERS, it wouldn't have had the chance to spread as widely as it spread. It would be much easier to find it. And actually for SARS, you know, in Hong Kong, we controlled SARS pretty effectively because it was so severe. We could identify all the cases, isolate them, trace the contacts, quarantine them. We didn't need to worry about silent transmission in the community, people traveling with asymptomatic infections and so on, because they didn't happen. So it's really the perfect, or you know, for the virus, it's the perfect combination. Really the most dangerous type of virus that we've ever seen, I think.
Dae-san, I'm sure you've been thinking about saying something. Want to chime in on that?
Oh, just a couple of things. I wanted to add to something you said earlier about SARS being the great experience and what Jacob was saying about Hong Kong people really pitching in and doubling down on hygiene, wearing masks all the time. We've had this tremendous response from the public. But it actually goes back further than SARS. And I wanted to bring this up because this is a conference about cities. Built into the DNA of every city globally are certain components. And Hong Kong's response to disease has formed it and shaped it pretty much since Hong Kong was founded in 1841. The fact that we have distinguished epidemiologists like Dr. Cowling in Hong Kong is because we had the bubonic plague at the end of the 19th century. Hong Kong government, the British government of Hong Kong, doubled down on hygiene, on public health. We started research centers. The bubonic plague bacillus was discovered here. So over history, Hong Kong has an extra large amount of its DNA invested in things like public health. We've got a huge bureaucracy of public health as well as a hospital system. So when COVID hit here, the combination of this bureaucracy, this public health system that we had in place, the infrastructure of public health was already here to support what the people were doing. So when you talk about did government in Hong Kong, were they the ones that actually it was already in place and they just had to help with the mechanism. Now you asked about the balance between economy and public health. There's a mechanism that I think at Cambridge that they came up with called suppress and lift. Have you heard about this? Hong Kong's government has largely been following the suppress and lift model. It's pretty evident from the title what it is. When you have high numbers of infection, you suppress public activity in different forms. When the infection is going down, you lift those restrictions. So the problem, it's a great model, you know, but there's no exact formula for it. And who decides what you suppress, when you lift? It's the governments that do. And that's why you need to have this public trust in place. The way it's been working in Hong Kong is that people themselves have been self-policing. And we've got a sort of wildly inconsistent actions on the part of the government. So we have, for instance, right now we can go to a karaoke bar, possibly the most terrible place to be in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. You're in a closed room with poor ventilation and everybody, my God, is singing. But our beaches are closed and we don't allow assemblies of more than 4 people. And that's, of course, being unevenly policed. So a friend of mine joked the other day that it seems like the Hong Kong government thinks that the 2 most contagious activities in Hong Kong are pro-democracy demonstrations and bathing. Anyway, as far as the economic activity goes, of course we have to put that back, but we can't think about putting back what there was before. And that's why when you say, you know, I mean, I do appreciate that this is a beautiful business, they're beautiful hotels, you want people to enjoy luxury, it is a human aspiration, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to put it back the way it was before. We're going to have to take our aspirations and modify the practices that we have.
Any lessons? I'd like to, Jacob and Clement, I'll start with you, Clement. Based on the experience of sometimes government directions can be clear, sometimes they're vague, sometimes you kind of have to read between the lines. As a big business, looking back at the experience, what what would you learn from that? I mean, is the onus on you to make those decisions for the business on top of what the government might tell you to do?
I think
to obviously protect your
Yes.
client and your employees themselves as well.
Okay, maybe at two levels.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
one level is that I agree that to fight something like this, cooperation is very important, and international cooperation is very important. And unfortunately, we see a world at the moment in which international cooperation is not where it should be, and that is something that is of concern because there are inconsistencies in terms of how people are handling different situations, and relating that to our business, that results in, honestly, inconsistencies in who has travel bubbles, who does not have travel bubbles, on what basis can you travel, on what basis can you not travel. It would be far better if we had a commonly accepted protocol, which, as said earlier, would entail a balance between risk and economy. But at least let's have collaboration on that, okay? At our level, it just teaches us that you have to be prepared for really something that can be very unexpected. And that, relates to financial planning, human resource planning, planning of, how, for instance, for us, a hotel is run in terms of hygiene and security. So taking all of those precautions, sometimes taking precautions in a business costs money and not necessarily easy to do. So, something like this reminds us that things can go wrong. Even something like financial planning. Right. You manage a company's balance sheet and you manage a company's financial position. And certainly we had never looked at a scenario like the one that we're seeing in terms of our financial planning, but it can happen. And for us, luckily, we have always been very conservative in things like our gearing and our financial borrowings. But this does put a different complexion on the way in which businesses plan and look to the future.
Jacob, before I bring in, it just occurred to me, on a lighter note, there was that whole run on toilet paper at the beginning of the year. Speaking of changes, I mean, have you done any changes to inventory of things, of essential things like masks and toilet paper? I mean, that's almost half joke, but in the same time, things that are unexpected can happen, and a hotel like yours cannot run out of toilet paper.
Well, I hope our operational people have taken good care of that. We've had plenty of toilet paper and food items and everything else.
All right, Jacob, well, to the extent, of course, I'm not sure how many of the writing public actually use your bathrooms, but that said, there are government regulations, and there are regulations as well that companies like yourselves take independently to do. What lessons did you learn in striking that balance or even doing a little bit more?
Well, our purpose, of course, is to keep Hong Kong running, and as Clement pointed out, we also look at the long term. Our infrastructure is a long-term investment. So during this difficult period, although we suffer along with Hong Kong, but we have tried to do our parts. We have given a 20% discount to fare. We have given significant rental concessions to our tenants in the station shops as well as the shopping malls, really to hopefully to share the load with our customers and with our business partners, really to go through this. And we will continue to invest into building new lines, in upgrading our services, and hopefully in the recovery stage after the pandemic, these investments will help to boost the recovery of the economy.
Ben, we were all speaking right before this started, travel bubbles, and how do we manage getting that in as soon as we can with the possibility, and I'll bake in one of the questions coming here from the audience, the possibility of a fourth wave, or a fifth wave, whatever you want to call it.
So even if we have a fourth wave in Hong Kong, we'll still have a very, very small number of infections, most likely in Hong Kong. In our third wave, we had about 5,000 infections. In a population of 7 million, it's still a very small number. So we could still operate a travel bubble successfully with other parts of the world that have similar risks, whether that's Singapore or other parts. I think mainland China is going to be sensitive about allowing travelers from Hong Kong when we have cases. Looking forward, I think we need to think about risk and benefit. So if we have a travel bubble with somewhere like Singapore, where there's very, very few cases, it really doesn't pose a risk to us in Hong Kong. We already have domestic infections at a small rate, and if we had one from Singapore, and luckily it would just be one more to add to a number of local infections, when we test on arrival, we already know we pick up the majority of infected travelers anyway, probably 60%. So travel bubble makes a lot of sense from places in the world that are low risk, but I'm not sure we're ready to accept travelers from around the world yet. Maybe in 6 months or 12 months' time, we can really go back to having global travel again.
What would be tangible steps that you would advise both governments, if you could, to get that in place? We were having this conversation, 14-day quarantine, for example. So you mentioned that kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so when we test people on arrival, if everybody's tested negative, there's really not much chance that someone's coming in with infection, because we know about 60% of infected travelers would test positive on arrival. So if you have a whole flight of people that are negative, it's likely that there's not going to be someone on the flight who's incubating infection. And if that's consistently happening over time, then it really does make sense to allow those travelers to come into the city, test negative on arrival, and then they're free to do what they like and keep an eye on the situation. So I think that may be the next step for us in Hong Kong. And because we're testing like we're doing with mainland China, as far as I know, there have been many, many thousands of people coming to Hong Kong from mainland China in the past months, none of them testing positive. So why do we still require them to have 14-day quarantine? To me, it doesn't make sense when we know there's a really minuscule risk of anyone coming in from mainland China with COVID. I think we keep an eye on the situation. If we start picking up positives, then maybe we change a little bit. But for now, it makes a lot of sense because we can get some parts of the economy going again.
Let me bring you back in. Once people start coming in, what kind of tourism sector are they looking at here in Hong Kong? How does that change? What stays?
Oh, boy. I'm really not sure at this point because I think we're a ways off from that. But what I hope we do is make it smaller and more locally focused rather than large groups of people. Last week, or was it this week, the government changed its protocols again about what you can and cannot do in Hong Kong because of COVID, and they added to the list of things that were permitted tour groups of 30 people. And this is at a time when it's not legal to have a gathering of more than 4 people in public, but they tossed that bone to the tourism industry because they're hurting, and I do understand that. At the same time, how do you justify having groups of 4 being criminalized, not criminalized, but slapped with fines, and groups of 30 being, and I personally think that a tour group of 30 people is just not sustainable in Hong Kong, period. Where are you going to be able to take a group of 30 people in Hong Kong? You have to take them out to the countryside or to a big open area. You can't really give a proper Hong Kong experience to that size of a group, and most of these will be domestic. These will all be domestic tourists anyway, but it's that kind of thinking that we can just, boom, go back and put our old tourism infrastructure in place. We can't. Now, what I see happening during this time is I see a lot of the smaller tour companies and even local initiatives coming up and using the skills that they developed as tour guides and tour creators to learn more about their communities and put on smaller human-scaled community activities and community festivals. And I think that as tourism begins to rethink and reset what it's all about, that we're going to start to see more of these very, very smaller scale initiatives, not just at the luxury level, but figure out a way to make them sustainable for average tourists of average income. I wanted to ask Ben a question.
Go ahead.
There are these new tests that are coming out. The UK has them in the airport now. They use a slightly different protocol or method from the ones that are required in Hong Kong. I'm very curious about these because it seems to me that if you've got testing at airports and you have a global agreement, or mostly global, as to what these tests should be, and if you're testing on both ends and these tests can be accomplished in an hour or 2, that's going to be a big game changer. What are your thoughts on that?
So the test that we're using right now in Hong Kong is called PCR, and it's very, very, very accurate. It rarely misses someone who's infected. The tests that you're talking about are rapid tests, which are not quite as good, maybe 80%, 90% accurate. So there's a risk that if we switch to using those, we might miss some infected people. That's not ideal. Actually, for the PCR test, it can be done very quickly. At the moment, we're just not that good at doing it quickly. So for example, in Hong Kong, there is a lab at the airport, but it's not Kai Tak Airport. So it's not the Lantau Airport, it's the Kai Tak Airport.
Kai Tak?
It's in Kai Tak. The airport lab is in Kai Tak, the old airport. So the samples from the people that land in Hong Kong are driven all the way to the old airport in Kowloon, And that's a delay of a few hours, right? And then the testing takes a few hours, and then you get the result the next day. If you put a lab at the actual airport, it could be turned around very, very quickly.
No idea. I thought nothing was left of Kai Tak Airport.
It's the cruise terminal.
Ship terminal.
It's in the cruise terminal.
Oh, they put it there because they thought cruise ship people would be,
Can I come back in?
Of course.
You raised the issue of tourism in Hong Kong and what people might find attractive and how we might develop Hong Kong further. Now, I would like to declare I have passed my 60th birthday already. I was born and brought up in Hong Kong, and I've seen how Hong Kong has developed and all of the changes that have taken place during all of these years. I have to say to you, I'm extremely proud of Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong has developed a lot, and therefore there's a lot to offer for people who come to visit, starting with just the whole spirit and the atmosphere and the ambiance of the place is a very special experience to come. And when people are here, of course, they get good service, good experiences, great food, and all of those activities. Now, you mentioned, okay, not everybody's at the peninsular end, but at the peninsular end, and this can apply to other people as well. People come and learn things like Tai Chi, dim sum making. There are sort of cultural related activities as well. By the way, that I think is an area that we can develop more. Hong Kong does have an interesting heritage, which I think probably we have not developed enough in terms of tourism. And there are some walking tours in Tsim Sha Tsui and things like this that are interesting for people, but I think maybe not as developed. But also an aspect of Hong Kong that most foreign people don't think about is the natural beauty of Hong Kong. And it's an amazing place in terms of, hills and water. Of course, is an island, so you get water views, you get mountain views. I'm a keen hiker, so I've been on many beautiful hiking trails. Of course, we will have to manage this within the sensible balance of COVID arrangements in terms of, when, how many people, what people can do, and so on. But I do believe that there are fundamental attractions that continue to be strong for Hong Kong. But I also think it's important for Hong Kong to develop itself, that as we go forward in the future, we have initiatives that are taken, more, projects, attractions being created, maybe linked in with the Greater Bay Area, and I think then, we'll see still a bright future for Hong Kong.
I agree with you. I'm also a keen hiker. In fact, yesterday I was hiking on Lama Island. I live on Peng Chau Island. Do you know Peng Chau?
I've been there once, I think.
I live on the island. I came not on the MTR today, but I came on the ferries. And I think, yes, that Hong Kong has beautiful natural locations to develop. However, my island, for instance, is, if they go ahead with the plan that they've got afoot, my island is going to be surrounded by landfill and concrete, and the most beautiful natural area of open harbor water in Hong Kong is going to be utterly destroyed. So I can't really accept the idea that, we certainly do need to develop our tourism here, but at the policy level, everything seems to be conspiring towards other priorities. I really hope that my island manages to survive the next 10 years.
Hopefully someone from the government's listening and take that,
There are quite a few of us that are working to try to stop the madness.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up too, and you as well. Not a lot of people who don't live in Hong Kong realize how easy it is to get from a densely populated city center to basically disappear into the mountains. The concept of social distancing almost applies in that, if you could use that analogy, when you're in the city center, people are doing that. When you disappear hiking, then it's sort of just, people are just further from each other. Then the concept of social distancing, do you think the best practices should remain once we get past this?
I think we'll see life going back to normal maybe in a year or maybe in 2 years, once we have vaccines and once people are kind of fed up with changing their behaviors to deal with COVID. I really hope that we're going to get vaccines that are effective and that will enable us to go back to normal, and then COVID would just be a nuisance every winter, like influenza, but it wouldn't be the kind of thing that forces us to shut the city down. I don't think we're ready to go back to normal yet, but maybe next year.
How far are we from a vaccine?
So there's a lot of promising candidates.
A proper vaccine.
Yeah, there's a lot of promising candidates that are being tested. We're expecting to hear some major trial results within the next maybe 2 or 3 months. And if those vaccines work out, fingers crossed, then we should start to see them being used in the major countries that are developing them, the US and Europe and China. We'll start to see them being used by early 2021. Hong Kong, maybe we can get it by April and start using vaccines April, May, June, July. And then towards the end of next year, hopefully having most people at least having the opportunity to get vaccinated if they'd like to.
I'm obviously not a medical expert, but this question has come up. Will the vaccine, assuming we get it next year, will that be the same vaccine that we'll use the year after, or do they need to figure it out from square one again?
So those kind of issues are not yet clear. Most of the vaccines being tested are 2 doses 1 month apart, so you need to get it once and then a month later get it again, and then you'll be protected. It's not clear whether you need to have a vaccine the following year or 2 or 3 years later, or if the vaccine will last for longer. Some of the vaccines that we use in children last for the full lifetime. Others, like the flu vaccine, you need it every single year. We'll have to wait and see. I think it's too early to say now what exactly would be the right strategy. But anyway, once we've had the first round of vaccinations, I think we will see people getting back to normal because they're kind of fed up with the social distancing, fed up with the travel restrictions, and will be able to go back to normal life without having the fear of what happened in New York in March and April with 20,000 deaths in a very short space of time.
And you've obviously shown empathy to the balance between employment and what level of health risk that can be taken. My concern is if it takes a year or two, the damage on the employment side would be severe. Now, I'm also a member of the World Travel and Tourism Council, and they've been doing quite a lot of studies about the number of people employed around the world and the potential unemployment arising from that. And I think, as you probably know, WTTC has been making various representations to governments as well, advocating, if you like, a more relaxed balance, as it were. I'm just expressing the concern that a year or two, the fallout from that may be very, very severe by then, because what we're seeing in our industry are mass layoffs, everywhere. And I guess one sector that we haven't touched on, because I represent a big brand hotel, but of course down in the street, we're aware that in Hong Kong, the small restaurants, many of the small and medium-sized enterprises, their suffering has been extreme.
The conversation that, to your point, that we have, say, on Bloomberg TV, day in and day out, is whether the layoffs that there was a first wave of layoffs across the world up until about April, May. Since then, what we've gotten is from various companies, whether that's Disney or different airlines. We have a very good example of that in Hong Kong this week. Are announcements that have a little bit of a permanent element to it. In other words, once the economy bounces back, the pickup in job growth might not be as quick coming back. So I'd like to ask, in fact, both of you as businesses, given that there's just so many moving parts right now, when we get a vaccine, do we get a travel bubble, et cetera, do you guys have enough visibility right now to revert back to your pre-pandemic plans, whether that's expansion, investments, what have you, hiring? Jacob?
In fact, when we plan forward, we don't plan to revert to the original plan. We have to consider as I reported earlier, there will be a permanent change in lifestyle, in traveling patterns, in work patterns, and so on, or even shopping patterns. So we will have to adapt to the new situation and go forward. We will continue to invest, but probably we'll invest more in terms of technology related provisions in our facilities, enable our citizens to basically to adapt to a new lifestyle.
Clement?
My business is very different from Jacob's. Although you might be aware, I used to work in Jacob's business. I was the finance director of MTR a long time ago. But whereas he carries 6 million, 7 million people a day, we have 300 hotel rooms, which is a completely different scale. So I would say that for our business, based on the confidence I expressed earlier, that in the long term, there will still be demand for super luxury services and products, that it is not impossible for us to return to where we had been before, provided the demand comes back. However, being able to foresee how long that's going to take is difficult. And so, for instance, at the moment, we have some hotels overseas which are running at maybe 15% occupancy. Clearly, you cannot maintain the same establishment at that level, but we are hopeful that we can bring that establishment back. But that would depend on, how quickly things can recover. I guess, once Jacob has built a railway or I've built a hotel, it's there, right? It's a fixed asset. You can't vary the size of it. And so therefore, you have to try and do what you can to make use of that asset and to utilize it the best you can and to bring it fully back into operation.
The concept of capacity then comes in. And I'm curious, on my earlier question, Ben, on social distancing and whether or not these things come back, you have an X number of trains, for example. You can move an X number of people. I mean, is a new normal, we go back to normal, or is a new normal a lot more trains, less people in each train? I'm curious what everyone thinks. Let me start with you, Jacob. Like, was that a thought experiment that you guys had?
Well, even at the peak of the pandemic, where we suffered probably a loss of 50% of our patronage, we maintain our service level at peak hours. We have reduced slightly our non-peak service, but we have maintained the crowding will not exceed 70%. For example, in non-peak, it will not exceed 70% of the capacity. So this actually helps to build confidence of our customers traveling in our system. Now, in fact, people on average spend about half an hour in our system, and they don't stay at one place. They move from station, platform, trains, and then platform, stations, and out. So they are constantly on the move, and with the enhanced ventilation and cleaning, obviously they have confidence in using the facilities. Now, in the future, we will. I believe that we will probably have to keep up some of the cleaning and ventilation regime just to achieve a higher level of hygiene to enhance confidence in traveling.
Ben, well, for one part of the question is, should we keep everything from cleaning stations, hand sanitizing stations in place? And the silver lining that's come up is, has this change in mindset that I need to wear a mask, I need to wash my hands, all these other things. Has that actually put to bed the usual flu, for example? I mean, are we getting evidence that people are getting less sick from other things because of what's happening? And should we keep those practices because of that?
Sure. In Hong Kong, we haven't had a single flu case for the last 6 months, or there's been almost no flu anyway in Hong Kong in the last 6 months. And I think now we recognize that if we were to face a heavy flu winter in some years' time, we could all be wearing masks. We hadn't really expected that people would be willing to do that, but now we will be. I think in general, for a general response, I think life will get relatively back to normal. I think will be changed because of the experience in COVID-19. Maybe we'll do things a little bit differently, but I don't think the government policies will still be in place in a couple of years' time. I think the governments will try and get things back to normal, and it's just our personal choices about whether we still travel, whether we wear a mask in daily life, and maybe we'll be more health aware, washing our hands more often, and more conscious of people's health around us.
You've written go ahead.
Well, just quickly, I think also you've made me think about ventilation. We had that conversation before. I think that things like building codes, particularly with respect to ventilation requirements and standards, things like that, there's going to be a huge, just as the search for a cure for the virus has supercharged epidemiological research, so will the need for added ventilation and sanitation and security. There's going to be a whole new sector of the economy that is going to be quite vigorous in terms of coming up with new innovative designs so that we can go to a restaurant and feel safe without wearing a mask.
Well, if I can comment on that, already what has happened for people like us is that we've invested a lot in various areas to do with environmental and sustainability. So things like air quality, something very focused on, types of filtration systems and all of that. Now, we've invested quite a lot. We have lots of standards and so on, but perhaps the consumer will pay more attention as well. They'll come along and ask, okay, what equipment or provisions do you have in a hotel to make me feel comfort that this is where I should be staying. And so, this is something I think that may become more of a factor.
You know what's well ventilated? Wet markets.
I love wet.
Does that change?
I love wet markets.
And you can also chime in a bit later. Go ahead.
I'm a wet market booster. I do a lot of my shopping in wet markets.
This is where that started, though. Is what I'm trying to get to.
It started, well, no, not actually. They're finding that actually it didn't. They found it in a wet market, but it had actually come from somewhere else.
Okay.
Wet markets in Hong Kong are probably cleaner than a United States supermarket, I would say, because as part of the reaction to the bubonic plague in the 19th century and the early 20th century, Hong Kong government, the British government of Hong Kong, instituted what we would term draconian regulations for hygiene and public health in the markets. Remember, this is at the time when a lot of times they didn't know where diseases were coming from, so they just doubled down on hygiene standards. And throughout this century, we've had regulations. I did an article about the persistence of live chicken sales in Hong Kong at the Gaisi. And when I started digging into it, I found out that in bird flu time, which was when, around 97, around the time of bird flu, there was this push to get rid of live chicken sales in Hong Kong. And the government was going to go along with it, but the public of Hong Kong needs to have live chickens. If you live here or you eat Cantonese food, you know that you must have the live chicken in order to have a delicious dish, because you can only get the texture with a live chicken. Anything, you're Filipino, right? You know, it doesn't taste the same.
It's very hard to describe.
It's hard to describe, but you must have the live chicken. And then a friend of mine who's a food anthropologist also pointed out to me that you can't give your ancestors a frozen chicken. You know, we often give food to the ancestors here. Giving your grandfather a frozen chicken just will not do. It's got to be live. So people were against this government edict. And so what happened was, over a period of years, government researched it, compromised, and developed an elaborate system by which we track every single chicken in Hong Kong from cradle to pot. For instance, the chicken in the market that's alive cannot sleep in the market. It has to be killed before the end of the day. You cannot keep them overnight. The chicken regulations run to 50 pages, the live chicken regulations. And as I was reading them, it just made me think, wow, the regulations on chickens and the way they gather, the chickens are social distanced. A lot of the regulations for the chicken trade that developed out of the bird flu scare are quite similar to the ways in which humans are being regulated during COVID. So it's another example of how Hong Kong's bureaucracy already had a lot of the structure in place to track and trace, because we were already tracking and tracing chickens.
And I'd like to invite everyone watching, of course, to read her article here in the New York Times, of course, talking about that as well, among other things. We're almost out of time. I think before I end, Ben, I'd like to ask you this question, and everyone else right after. Well, in your case, because of people like you, and in what you do, we're better off right now for the next one. Are we prepared for the next one? Can we prepare for the next one?
So I hope that we won't see anything like this in our lifetimes again. The last time we had something like this was the 1918 influenza pandemic, before any of us were born. Hopefully the next one wouldn't be for another 100 years, but we don't know. We do need to be prepared, and I think we've learned in Hong Kong that the preparation was worth it. All the money that we invested in the public health system, in the hospital system, in laboratory testing for test and trace, all of those kind of preparations have paid off now, and it's a worthwhile investment going forwards. Better laboratory testing equipment, better capacity for doing all of that stuff, better hospital care, better public health system. I think we're going to need to invest going forwards. And for Hong Kong specifically, I think you mentioned we really want a vaccine as soon as possible. Maybe that means in Hong Kong we've got to invest a little bit more in vaccine research and development, because we don't have any domestic vaccine production capacity. So we're not at the front of the queue for a vaccine. We're second, third, fourth in line, because places that make the vaccine are going to be able to get it first.
We're almost out of time. Very quickly, 10 seconds or so. On a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic are you about the future? Jacob?
I'm cautiously optimistic, probably a 7 out of 10.
That's fair. Ben?
Yeah. 8 out of 10 for the future.
look at you.
Yeah, definitely
Yes.
8 or more. If you look longer term, we have to fight through what we've got.
I'm with Jacob, 7 out of 10, and we have to really rethink and reset. It won't be bad.
Well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Given that, and we'd like to end, of course, on that point. Thank you so much for making time for us. I'd also like to thank, of course, the Peninsula specifically for this beautiful setting and playing host to us here. Again, for our viewers, I'd like to reintroduce here our panel before I go. Professor Ben, of course, our expert here in epidemiology and infectious diseases. Mr. Jacob Kam, of course, CEO of MTR Corporation. Clement Kwok, out of Peninsula, Hong Kong, and Shanghai hotels. And of course, Ms. Daisy McLean here, veteran journalist and writer and contributor, of course, to many publications, Nat Geo, New York Times included. And on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. And let's get 2020 behind us.